All right, folks, it is November the 18th, 2025, which means a lot's going on in the world as always, and we'll be talking about that. And we've also got a special guest that'll be discussing something on the political front and definitely talking about a system that a lot of us hear about, but probably don't have a understanding and all in that way. But in terms of the news, Saudi Crown Prince is returning to the U.S. for the first time after diplomatic isolation. So Trump has an elaborate welcome plan for MBS during the Saudi Crown Prince's White House visit. So that is something that is going on in the news, and people are talking about that. UN support bolsters Trump's Gaza plan, but road ahead is still rough. UN Security Council votes to endorse Donald Trump's Gaza plan. So UN plan just first step toward the peace in Gaza, says the Palestinian foreign minister. After UN vote, Netanyahu calls for Hamas expulsion from the region. So that is something that is going on in that part of the world there in the Middle East. Poland rail explosion. The prime minister says blast was unprecedented act of sabotage, and two Ukrainian men believed to be working with Russia identified as suspects in the Polish rail sabotage attack. So Polish train tracks that help transport aid to Ukraine destroyed in act of sabotage. That's what their prime minister is saying in that area. Bangladesh former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been sentenced to death. So this was reported on yesterday, but that is still some things that folks are talking about. Justice for victims of 2024 massacre not served by death sentence against Sheikh Asani is what Amnesty International is claiming, and all along those lines. So they're even saying that the Hassani death sentence sets the stage for a volatile Bangladesh vote. So a lot of countries around the world are having votes. I know there were some in Chile and other places as well. Japan warns citizens in China about safety as diplomatic crisis deepens. So Japan's Takeshi has few good options to end China's backlash. Chinese travelers are canceling hundreds of thousands of trips to Japan amid the rising tension between those two Asian countries. And a mysterious poisoning case deepens after the death of two children and their parents. So definitely that is something that people are talking about, as the mom and the kids were killed in a food poisoning horror. So it was actually the mom that looks like was the one that was killed in this particular case. So mom and two kids died of suspected food poisoning after allegedly eating street food at a popular tourist site in Australia. So that's something that people are talking about as well. And UK proposes a new asylum policy with a 20-year wait and asset seizures. So it looks like Britain is embracing the negative nation branding, and it looks like there's even some people that are asking how serious is labor backlash over asylum plans. So definitely that is something that people are talking about in the European area. And I did mention Chile. Communist and far-right candidates head to Chile presidential runoff. So that looks like that's going on there. Chile's most polarized presidential race in decades boosts the right and divides immigrants. So there's definitely some division going on there as well. And whatever Trump's goal in Venezuela, U.S. military action is unlikely to achieve it. And there are even some people like at the Hill that are saying Maduro is the last chance to negotiate a peaceful exit from power. So definitely we'll see whether that goes on and how that plays out as well. So that's definitely one of the countries that people talk about, even when they talk about socialism and all along those lines. And my guests will be bringing that conversation to our forefront very shortly and all along those lines. So definitely a lot's going on in that space. House poised to pass a bill to force the release of the Epstein files in a bipartisan vote. So Congress is expected to release all Epstein files. Trump worries that won't be enough. So definitely that's something going on, as we're going to see how much of the files are released and what kind of repercussions, if any, are held there. And I'm here in North Carolina, in Durham, North Carolina, and I know that there was talk of ICE agents coming up to Raleigh, which is the city next to us here in Durham. But they're saying that nearly 21,000 Charlotte Mecklenburg students were absent from school on Monday, officials say. And definitely that was the first city in North Carolina that they had come to, and all along those lines. So federal agents to begin immigration operations in Raleigh, the mayor of that city said, which is the capital city here in North Carolina. So mass federal immigration sweeps expand to North Carolina's capital city. And apparently, Border Patrol, according to WCNC, which is one of the Charlotte stations, arrested two U.S. citizens in Charlotte for allegedly warning others of the operation. So we'll see how this all plays out as well. And Larry Summers to step back from public commitments over the Epstein emails. Larry Summers says he's deeply ashamed after new Jeffrey Epstein emails and will pause public engagements. Elisa New, the wife of Larry Summers, mentioned Lolita in an email to Jeffrey Epstein. So it definitely looks like that is at least one repercussion of those letters that is out now. We'll see if there's others that come about as well. Indiana homeowner charged in fatal shooting of a house cleaner who showed up at the wrong door. Indiana man accused of killing house cleaner who mistakenly arrived at the front door has been charged with manslaughter, and that was a gentleman in the Whitestown area of Indiana and all along those lines. And Mackenzie Scott gives 700 millions to historically black colleges. So Mackenzie Scott tells her college roommate loaned her $1,000 so she wouldn't have to drop out, and is now inspiring her to give away billions. So billionaire Mackenzie Scott makes more historic donations to HBCUs, and A&T, North Carolina A&T, received a transformative $63 million investment from that philanthropist. So definitely looks like they are giving some money to some various HBCUs. And Sacramento scandal, a wild card for Xavier Becerra and the governor's race. So former aide to California governor indicted for alleged theft of campaign funds from an ex-health secretary. So definitely that's something that's going on as well. And Trump's comments about Fuentes and Carlson could prolong a Republican rift. Once he was just asking questions, now Tucker Carlson apparently is the question. So Trump defends Tucker Carlson after the Nick Fuentes interview and all along those lines, but apparently that is dividing those in the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. AOC says OC primary challenge against Jeffries, not a good idea. So potential Jeffries primary challenge puts Mamdani in a tough spot, and definitely looks like this left-wing Gen Z New York City councilman Chi Osi is gearing up for a primary challenge against Hakeem Jeffries, who, as many people know, is one of the rising stars in the Democratic Party. So we'll see how this all plays out, and if this is another example of the youth vote being out there, not just here, but globally as well. And Trump says America is in the golden age, straining to address affordability. Trump's drive-through affordability speech won't fix his political woes over the economy, is what CNN reported. But Trump says Americans are damn lucky he's in office in his first affordability speech. So he spoke at the McDonald's Impact Summit and all along those lines. So that is something that was going on as well. And Trump says the U.S. will sell F-35s to Saudis despite the Pentagon concern. So definitely that is something going on as well. And that sale might even be formalized or announced even further in the situation that's going on with the Saudi Crown Prince visit and everything like that. So we'll see how that plays out. And definitely there's a lot going on between Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene and Trump. Apparently she's blaming Trump for hoax, pizza harassment, and some other things going on as well, because she blasted Trump for vicious attacks amid a pipe bomb scare and death threats against her son. So definitely, like, there may be some rifts even in the Republican Party as well. So it sounds like there are rifts in both parties and all along those lines. There's some other news that we might get to later and everything, but right now I'm going to bring in my special guest, Dr. Doug Cartel. I see that I've got other folks that are here with us as well, including Nick Palveda, who is one of the founders of the network, and he may be joining us later, and we'll see if Sasha and others come in as well. So, Dr. Cartel, you've written a book about socialism, and socialism became a big topic. And I mentioned Mamdani that he won, and some of the things that he has proposed, like grocery stores that are community owned. I think he wants one in each borough, and some of the other things some folks are saying are socialistic principles. Even I think he identifies himself as a democratic socialist, and all along those lines. So I was just wondering if you could maybe share with our audience a little bit about your book and how you came about some of your thesis and what the book is all about, because I do know that you've been very much involved in studying not just socialism, but probably also capitalism, whether that's laissez-faire capitalism or other types of capitalism as well, but the book is primarily focused on socialism. And we've also got Dr. Sharif who will be joining us later, and he comes from Bangladesh, which has got a monarchy, if I remember correctly, and everything like that. But definitely just tell me a little bit about your book and the whole notion of socialism.
Well, thanks, Mark. The book is called Why Socialism Struggles, Exposing the Economic Errors that Undermine Utopian Ideals. And I think to start out, since you mentioned Mamdani and is declaring himself to be a democratic socialist, there is no such thing as a democratic socialist. They think there is, but there isn't. Socialism is a system in which the government owns all property and the means of production. The places that democratic socialists usually refer to are the Nordic countries and some of the other European countries.
Right.
And those countries call themselves social democracies, not democratic socialism. None of the Nordic countries have taken over property, all property, or the means of production. There's only a few socialist countries in the world. North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba are prime examples. And the people that are advocating for socialism, most of them don't really know what they're asking for. Is anybody in their right mind actually saying that they would like to see the United States transition to be a country like North Korea? I don't think so. You mentioned Mamdani and him wanting to put in state grocery stores.
Right.
It's just a silly idea. Why? Well, because grocery stores have one of the smallest markups of any business, usually runs around 3%. So they're paying. So when you go to the grocery store, you're typically paying about 3% above wholesale.
Right.
Now, where does the wholesale come from? Well, that's the trick, is that Walmart, Costco, Kroger, the big buyers get deep, deep discounts on wholesale, typically around 15 to 20%. If Mamdani tries to sell stuff at wholesale, he'll save the 2 or 3% markup, but he'll lose the 15 to 20% reduction caused by huge buying power, because New York just doesn't, it sounds like a big market, but compared to Walmart or Kroger or Costco, it's a tiny, tiny market. So we won't get those kinds of deep discounts, which means it'll have to be paid for by the taxpayers.
You mentioned, and I hear the points that you're making and everything like that. You mentioned the other thing that I know some people that are fans of socialism or claim to be fans of socialism talk about is medical care, because definitely that is something that has been very expensive in the U.S. under the existing system and all along those lines. And sometimes people, even though it is not a socialist country, they'll point to some of the systems in Canada that apparently have adopted some socialized medicine. So they'll point to Canada, they'll point to, I believe, Denmark and some other places in Europe, coming back to your European basis. So I just wanted your thoughts around that, because I do hear people that are in my friend circle that are claiming to be more on the left side than on the right side of politics and everything, that's some of the things that they'll point to when they are advocating things that some people may consider socialist, whether that's medical care or whether that's the fight to have a higher minimum wage, because a lot of times people will complain about that in the capitalist system, and there are a number of people that have been fighting to get it up to 15, even though some people think that that's not even good wages and everything like that. So I just wanted your take on those two issues, because those are the two issues that I hear people that are advocates of socialism bringing in Canada and that whole notion of what they do with their medical care.
Sure. The places that are social democracies typically do have a larger, what you might call a safety net, than the United States. Many of them are beginning to back away from that because they're finding out that it's just too expensive. Medical care is a really good example of the problems that are created when government intervenes. The mess we've gotten into in healthcare began back in the 40s when Roosevelt imposed wage and price controls. So as a result, the companies started offering health insurance in order to attract people when they couldn't raise wages because of the wage and price controls. Now, the effect of that was that then the government came in and offered tax deductions and lots of other things to help boost that idea of medical insurance. Here's the problem. Anytime you separate the consumer and the producer, the economy doesn't work. And that's exactly what's happened in healthcare. When I was growing up in the 50s, my grandfather was a doctor. He lived in a normal 3-bedroom house, nothing special. He wasn't by any means rich. He was a really good doctor, had a large patient following. But because of the wage and price controls, the cost of medicine has been going up dramatically. And in fact, nowadays, most doctors make hundreds of thousands a year. Why is that? Because we can't shop for healthcare. When I go to the doctor, I have no idea how much the doctor is charging. I have no idea how much any medical tests I get are costing. So since we can't shop, the consumer and the producer can't negotiate price. What that typically means is that the middlemen in the system, in this case, healthcare providers and insurance companies, make a lot more money, and we have to pay a lot more. What's the answer? Well, we'd have to do it gradually, but we have to start returning to a time when we can shop for healthcare. The first step would be, let us see all the prices. Let us know exactly what we're paying. And I think if we would see that, we would immediately start to go, hey, this company is charging too much. This doctor is charging 3 times what this other doctor is charging. And we would start to make sound decisions. But when we're separated, we can't do that. Now, I have to add an addendum here, and that is that when my grandfather was a doctor, his education was really inexpensive.
Right.
Now, the doctors aren't just making money hand over fist for no reason. Part of the reason is because they've paid exorbitant amounts for their education, which was also caused by the government intervening in education.
Yeah, that makes sense. You also mentioned I mentioned earlier the minimum wage, and I know that that's something that people talk about when they think about the advantages of socialism. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that. And the other thing that I've heard some people advocate for that are fans of democratic socialism or social democrats and all along those lines is the notion of what we can do with housing, because housing is a big issue. We talk about it quite a bit here on this network and everything along those lines. And there are some people that think that you will have greater access to cheaper housing under other political systems other than capitalism and everything like that. So what would your answer be to those folks that are thinking that that is a solution to a major problem?
Well, to start with minimum wage, again, it's a very similar problem to that of healthcare. Anytime the government sets a wage, you're preventing the producer and the consumer from negotiating value. If you're going to set a minimum wage, why stop at $15 an hour? Why not make it $100 an hour, $1,000 an hour? Well, the reason why not is because the consumer won't pay that.
Right.
So what will happen? Well, what's happened, let's say, with cashiers in grocery stores? They're being replaced by self-checkout. Why? Because the consumer is going to go to a store that offers better prices. If to do that, they have to go through self-checkout, they'll do it. When I was a kid, I worked in a gas station filling gas tanks. I was one of the ones that was laid off when they started switching to self-serve tanks. Why? The consumer wasn't willing to pay me the extra to fill their tank for them. They said, no, I can do it myself cheaper.
Right.
So when that happens, in the long run, it creates huge disparities. And so a good place to look at is the Women's Garment Union back in the 80s. you may be old enough to remember they had this cute little jingle, look for the union label when
Yes.
you're buying, blah, blah, blah. Well, what happened was they did look at the union label, but they also looked at the price.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened? All of the women's garments went to either right to work states or foreign countries. And 3 years later, the women's garment union folded completely.
Oh, well.
So
What about the
you've got
housing
a
issue?
choice. You can either have higher wages now and your kids can't get a job, or you're going to be replaced by a machine, because the consumer is the ultimate decider. And that's what the socialists never get.
Yeah.
If we want to have a free country, we have to have a country where we're free to buy what we want. And that means the consumer rules. And the only way to make the economy work is to have the consumer and the producer negotiate prices. Now, you mentioned housing.
Yes.
Housing is a little more complicated and harder to explain, but I'll give it a shot. When I was a kid, again, he have to keep referring to back in the day, but it's the only way you can compare economies. When I was a kid, we were middle class. The house we lived in was 961 square feet. Now, in today's terms, that would be called a tiny home.
Right.
We had no central air conditioning. In fact, we had no air conditioning at all. We had oil-fed central heat with radiators in every room. We had no dishwasher, no microwave, no dryer. Now, today, yes, houses cost a lot more, but you're getting a lot more. The average house today is 2,500 square feet,
Right.
almost 3 times the size of the house that I lived in when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
They also almost every house comes with central air, washers and dryers, microwaves, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So, yes, houses cost more now, but if you actually look at the square footage and the number of people living in the house. Now, remember, that 961 square foot house I lived in had 6 people living in it, my parents and my 3 siblings. Today, that averages 3 to 4 people in a 2,500 square foot house. So if you do all the math and work out how many square feet you get for how much money, it's actually cheaper to buy a house today than it was then.
Yeah.
Finally, people are looking for bigger stuff. Today, you can buy a mobile home that's bigger than the house I lived in as a kid, with far more amenities, and you can buy an acre of land for $10,000. So for $110,000, you can get what I had as a kid. But the problem is that people today think they want what people that are buying bigger stuff want, and you can't make that work.
Yeah.
People have to start thinking in terms of a starter home, not saying I want to go out and buy a $500,000 house my first year out of college. It's not going to work.
Yeah. Now, before I bring in some of the other panelists and everything along those lines, the other question I had is that I know sometimes people will look at cities or entities that are community owned and everything along those lines. I am a somewhat of a football fan and everything like that, and I don't necessarily root for this team, even though an ex used to be a very big fan of this particular team that I'm going to mention. But some people will point to the Green Bay Packers, which is supposedly completely owned by the city, and all along those lines as an example of a socialist kind of principle that can work and everything like that. So I just wanted your take on that, because you do see some people that are community-based businesses. I'm just using Green Bay Packers as an example. There are stores that are built that way, and there are other things that are built that way as well. But I just wanted your take on that, because that is something that people will point to when they're thinking of this notion of community-owned property, which is supposedly a principle of either socialism or communism and everything like that. So I just wanted your take when you hear people that use the sports example. Like I said, I know there are other teams and there are other businesses, but being a sports fan, I know about the Packers, and I know that that's one example that people will toss at you.
Yeah, well, there are certainly examples of community-owned businesses. Usually they're relatively small, and most of the time in the long run, they fail. for the same reason. There's no negotiation between consumer and producer. And the whole idea of capitalism, and by the way, I should point out, capitalism isn't perfect. Part of the problems, though, with capitalism are usually caused by government intervention, like the wage and price controls I mentioned earlier, things like minimum wage that reduce the ability for communication, for consumers to negotiate with producers for how much something is going to cost. And that's the heart of capitalism. Unfortunately, the government too often intervenes and does stuff that actually hurts the ability to do that. Where I live in Arizona, we have what's called the open range laws. Mm-hmm. And you probably aren't familiar with them. You're in North Carolina?
Yes, I'm in North Carolina.
And yeah, I'm pretty sure you probably don't have those there. But here, what that means is that cattle basically have the right of way. If you don't want cattle on your property, you have to fence them out. Now, I have a few acres here in Arizona, and I've spent thousands of hours and thousands of dollars fencing out cattle. You have to have this very specific kind of fence. It has to have posts X far apart, barbed wire at very specific heights. And if you don't build that fence and a cow gets in, crashes through your patio door and eats your furniture, that's your problem. Worse yet, if you're driving down a highway in Arizona and you hit a cow, if you get killed, your heirs will have to pay for the cow.
Oh, wow. So they've got to pay for the cow and everything like that?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That's insane.
Yeah, that's insane. It's interesting you bring that up because we had a case here in North Carolina. It was a very sad case of a woman that was killed in a parade. She was killed in our Christmas parade. I think it was about 3 years ago and everything like that. So I was watching it in the news yesterday, and the person that it was an involuntary manslaughter, it was an accident and everything like that. But the person that wound up killing that kid got sentenced. But ironically, one of the things that he had to do was he had to give, which I think would be devastating to me, but he had to give the truck that killed the poor little girl to the family. So I found that kind of unusual and that kind of unusual method and everything along those lines of justice. But I guess that they can figure out what they maybe even wind up selling that truck or something like that to make money for their court costs. But just really quickly, I'm going to bring in Nick Valveda. He's one of our founders. I'm also going to bring Rick, because I see Rick's got a question already for you and everything like that. But there is a third system that we don't talk about. And I know Nick is a big fan of it because he comes from that family of people and all along those lines. And that is, I wish Dr. Sharif was still here, but that's the whole notion of monarchy, because Nick is the founder of the network, but he also comes from a royal family. So sometimes people are thinking that we need to go toward the monarchy, even though we here in the United States left a monarchy because when the folks came over from England, and not the rest of the folks that came over sometimes in bondage from Africa, most of the time in bondage from Africa and other places. But there were a number of people that came escaping the monarchy. So what is your take on monarchies? Because monarchies are also out there as a system. And does that system work or not work?
Well, if you're asking me, hi, Nick and Rick, by the way. Monarchies cover a really, really wide range. So are we talking monarchy like Great Britain? Are we talking monarchy? Well, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there are monarchies certainly where the monarch has far more power than the monarch in Great Britain does. And so we have to, first of all, define exactly what we mean. Most people would say that while Great Britain is technically a monarchy, it's actually a democracy. Mm-hmm. The monarch has very, very limited power. In other monarchies, the monarch has far more power, and then it essentially becomes closer to socialism. Because when we talk about socialism, it's important to point out that what we're really talking about is a centrally planned economy. Right. And it doesn't really matter how that happens. So, for example, people like to talk about fascism as being the opposite of socialism. That's nonsense. Fascism and socialism are almost the same thing. In fascism, the government controls the economy. In socialism, the government owns the economy. If you're in a monarchy where the government controls the economy, it's basically the same thing as socialism. If you're in a country like Great Britain, it's basically the same thing as a democracy. Yeah.
That makes sense. Rick, you had a question? I'm gonna bring
Yeah, I
you.
want to ask about what we do about AI. So, for 100 years, people have said that the technology will make people unemployed, and it really hasn't done that. But what it has done is create a bunch of crappy jobs where more than a third of American workers are in the gig economy, which is, like DoorDash and Uber, and those jobs are freaking terrible. And for a lot of people where you're not making a lot once you account for your expenses. And if AI keeps making the world of work crappier, and if it keeps making income inequality, so since 1979, the top 1% has gotten their wages have increased by 160%. The bottom 90% only 29%. And yeah, I agree that there's never been a better time to be poor, because you can be poor and still have a 60-inch TV. But how do we address frickin' AI in the hands of like tech billionaires who might be jerks?
Well, here's the rub, if you want. Karl Marx, the initial communist, lived in the late 1800s, but he was raised in the early 1800s. And he lived in a time when there was a small village surrounded by mom and pop stores. He thought that was the ideal world. So when he designed communism, he designed it to keep the world that way. He thought that corporations, companies, were evil because they created progress. And progress shut down the mom and pop stores. He thought that was just terrible. Now he's right. Big companies did shut down mom and pop stores. But things of large scale can't be done in mom and pop stores. The internet we're talking on right now couldn't happen with mom and pop stores. The technology we're using, the computers, the cell phones, can't happen with mom and pop stores. You have to have economies of scale. Here's the problem. You can view progress like a rubber band. And here's what typically happens, and will probably happen with AI. At first, things will accelerate dramatically for the better off. So, for example, think about computers. First computer I bought was a TRS-80. It cost me, I think, if I remember right, around $3,000. Okay. By today's standards, it was a toy. It has nothing to do with modern computers. But because people who could afford them, the early adopters, bought computers like that, the technology rapidly ramped up. And now almost everybody has a cell phone, which dramatically will outperform a TRS-80 computer.
Yeah.
So we all get stuff that's way beyond what people could have had back in the 80s, let's say. Way beyond. And the same thing is going to happen with AI. Yes, for a while, it will produce crappy jobs, to use your words. But over time, it will produce better and better jobs. And so that's what I mean by a rubber band, is that you'll see a huge progress among the upper class, if you want to use that term. But then as that rubber band starts to contract, it'll pull everybody else along with it. How do I know this? Well, look at the world from the year 0 to say 1500 and compare GDP per capita. That is how much each person in the economy produces. And what change do you see? None. The world did not progress at all from the year 0 to the year 1500. That's about the time capitalism started being born. What happened was from 1500 to about 1700, there was incremental progress. From 1700 on, mostly due to the rise of capitalism in the United States, progress was gigantic. Per capita GDP is now 30 times higher than it was in 1700.
Yeah, that makes sense. Everything.
World
You
GDP.
do, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
I was going to say, do you do a lot with case studies and everything like that? Because I know one of the things we talk about here is a failed socialism country, and I know it's one that President Trump has been going after because of the drug trade and everything like that. That namely being Venezuela to the south of us, and some people would also point to Cuba as an example of socialism. And I know that a lot of people, because they have one of the bigger populations of the world, point to China, even though China, I think, identifies itself as a communist country and everything like that. And I'm not sure what India's government is described as, but I know they have some socialistic principles and everything like that. And they are definitely, India and China, two of the biggest economies of the world. So I just wondering if you do case studies and what your case studies are finding.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the ones I did was looking at the personal consumption index, which is one of the measures one uses to look at the economy. And that's part of the problem with any centrally planned economy is how does a centrally planned economy work? Well, the government takes over and hires somebody like me and says, now, Dr. Doug, plan the economy for us. Well, here's the problem. You can't plan what you can't predict. In other words, in order for me to plan the economy, I've got to have some idea of where it's going to go next. I don't have any idea. No economist does. When I looked at the personal consumption index over a 30-year period, what I found out was that the government was right in their prediction 46% of the time. Now, that's not economics, that's guessing. Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to plan an economy, you need to know things like how many cell phones should I produce next year? What kinds should I produce? And the problem is nobody knows that. Why not? Because the economy is what's called a chaotic system. Chaotic systems were originally noticed by a guy named Lorenz, who was studying the weather. What he found out was that these tiny, tiny inputs in his weather models would make huge differences in the output. You probably have heard his, I guess you'd call it a butterfly topic, when he said, is it possible that a butterfly's flapping its wings in Brazil could precipitate a tornado in Texas? And you could draw a parallel in the economy and say, is it possible that somebody buying a pair of shoes in Peru triggers a depression in Poland? And the answer is, yeah. Why? Well, like I'm in Arizona right now. It's supposed to be pouring rain, according to the weather report. It's bright and sunshiny. What Lorenz proved was you can't predict the economy more than the weather more than about 2 weeks out. And about the same is true of the economy. I could make a really good guess about how many cell phones to produce 2 weeks from now. A year from now, hopeless.
Yeah, just really quickly, and I did see some hands raised as well and everything like that. One of the fears that people have about socialism, or any government for that matter, is that what happens after it fails and it is down? Will the substitute government be worse? I mean, that's one of the fears that people have about Russia, if Russia should be, if Putin should die, or if Russia should be destroyed by Ukraine and all along those lines. And I know that's a fear that people have about Venezuela. Will it be, and Cuba, will it be a worse government under the new administration or the new regime versus the old regime? We've seen that happen in Asian and African countries, just to name two continents and everything like that. So I just wanted your take on this notion of the fear factor, because there are some people that are looking at these different political models and are afraid of what would come next if those systems are destroyed.
Well, I certainly think socialism is something to fear. It's never succeeded in the history of the world. It can't succeed because you can't predict what's going to happen. Therefore, you can't plan. When Russia had 5-year plans, they always failed because trying to predict 5 years out what you're going to do never works. Another thing to look at is people vote with their feet. Well, where does the most immigration to occur? To the United States. Yeah. How many people do you see in countries like the United States, Great Britain, or India fighting to migrate to North Korea or Venezuela or Cuba. You don't see it. If socialism was wonderful, that's where people would be going, but they're not.
Yeah. Nick, Rick, you had a question, and Steve.
Yeah, so tech makes things cheaper. Like the cost of food and clothing compared to 120 years ago is like 25% because tech has made it cheap to make stuff. And that trend will continue and will disrupt other industries. Medicine's still expensive. It should get cheaper in the next few decades. Housing will probably get a little cheaper. So is it socialism when tech makes stuff so freaking cheap that it's almost free? Is it socialism to give people, super cheap stuff?
Well, socialism's got a problem giving anything to anybody because socialism doesn't have anything. All they can do is take from the people and redistribute it. The problem with that is what the problem has always been with socialism. You may not realize this, but the United States began as a collectivist country. Jamestown and the Mayflower colony both started out collectivist, and they very quickly devolved into starvation because people found out really quickly that the hardest workers just stopped working. Why? Because they didn't benefit them. People are basically self-interested. Now, I need to define the difference. Self-interested is not the same as selfish. Selfish means I try and take from you just because. Self-interest means I have to look out for myself.
Right.
And I do. But I don't do that to excess. I don't take from you just because. And one way we look at that in economics is we look at what's called the pie. That is how much stuff there is. Remember I mentioned earlier about between 0 and 1,500. The pie was a fixed size. That is, the amount of stuff there was in the world didn't change. It was all just there. So if you wanted to get more, you had to take it from somebody else. That was the only way to get it. But since 1,500, and particularly since about 1,700, capitalists have been growing the pie. That is, we make more stuff, so more stuff is available that we can all share. That's really the point, is that everybody ends up better off. Capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any other system that's ever been imagined. 100 years ago, most of the world lived in abject poverty. Now it's 9%. And that's worldwide. Okay.
Dr. Craig, what do you
let me get in one more question here.
Yeah.
So how do you think the U.S. is doing? The Heritage Foundation has an economic freedom index, which is basically how capitalistic are you as a nation? And the U.S. it's not in the top 10, but it's the most capitalistic country of its size. And that's pretty steady across the decades.
Well, actually, it's recently dropped. It's in the 20s now. And if you look at economic, you mentioned the Heritage Foundation, they also do it by state. And while many of the U.S. states have some of the highest GDP, they have some of the least economic freedom compared to other countries. Actually, Great Britain right now is listed by the Heritage Foundation as having greater economic freedom than the U.S. So it depends. When you say depending based on the size, it depends on.
Let's talk about my state. I'm in California, and we're always accused of being, a hell state, and everything's terrible because of socialistic practice. And I like it here. I'm in LA, and we get accused of having huge taxes. My state taxes have never run more than, like 6%. And our property taxes are ridiculously low because of Prop 13, where if you live in your house for 20 years, you're paying 1/3 of 1%, which is lower than anyway. So California, for instance.
Your take on California in terms
How
of
are we doing? Because to me, it seems like we're doing okay, except for the 100,000 homeless that we have.
Yeah. Well, I think in general in the U.S., we're doing okay. Obviously, like I said, everybody wants to move here from throughout the world. I saw a recent Gallup poll that said a fourth of the world would move here if they could.
wow.
Well, I mean, you can't say we've got a bad place here if a fourth of the world wants to get here. And
I hear
as
what
I
you're saying,
also
Dr.
said,
Cartel, but in
you
that
won't
same
see a whole lot of
realm,
Americans clamoring to go somewhere else.
no, I don't see that. But Dr. Cartel, in that same realm, you see a lot of people that are concerned about the widening income gap and everything like that. Because I'm actually friends with, actually, he's a family member, Dr. Darity, that had been doing some research about reparations for African Americans and everything along those lines. But part of what he talks about is the growing wage and income gap that exists between our society. So we have the very rich, like the Elon Musk that Rick was referring to, but we also have very poor here in the U.S. as well, and that seems to be widening. So that seems to be one of the problems that people have with the capitalist system as it works in the United States. So I just wanted your take on that complaint and what can be done as an economist in your mind to address that.
Well, first of all, as I said, in times of dynamic change, we have that rubber band effect. So you're always going to see income inequality and wealth inequality grow dramatically initially, but then you're going to see it contract and make everybody better off. It's just an unfortunate fact of the way progress has to work, because you have to have a way for somebody to lead the way to the new place, and then they drag everybody else along with them. And yes, that's going to take time, but by the greatest measures of inequality, income inequality, the U.S. is pretty much right in the middle compared to the other countries in the world. We're basically right in the middle. We have about the average inequality. And the places where there's the most inequality is the socialist countries. Look at North Korea. The in-group has money hand over fist. The poor are poor beyond our ability to imagine it. Okay. They have literally at times been in situations where they had to eat their children.
Wow.
That's poverty at a level that we can't even comprehend.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Kim Jong-il lives in a huge mansion and gets anything he wants. You want to talk about inequality, you have to look at socialism.
Right. So, by any estimation, the rubber band is going to keep stretching for the next couple of decades because AI is going to freaking disrupt everything. So my question is, as you know, you've got can we avoid like a French Revolution kind of thing? Will benefits for the poor and the middle class trickle down fast enough to keep the world from revolting against the rich?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And basically the answer is, if the government stays out of it, the answer is yes. Because here's what happens. As that rubber band stretches and the government intervenes, it tends to contract a whole lot slower. Because the problem is that government can't react as fast as people can react. This is the idea of what's called spontaneous order. Spontaneous order is the idea that small entities inside a large entity can operate independently and make stuff work out just fine. Your body is an excellent example of that. Okay? We like to think that our brains control everything in our body. That's utter nonsense. First of all, half your body isn't even human. That's literally true. About half of the cells in your body are viruses, bacteria, fungi. Clearly, your brain has no control over those. But even the cells of your body are not under your control. You cannot control a single cell in your liver. that cell, that liver cell in your body, doesn't even know you exist. It lives in what it sees as an environment, your liver, and it does what it has to do to survive. It just sits there being a cell. And sometimes that gets out of control. Cancer is a good example of that. And so if God forbid any of us ever get cancer, we're going to have to take action. That's the government's job. The government then has to intervene and say, that cancer cell has gotten too selfish. It's going beyond self-interest and exploiting the rest of the body for its own benefit. So we have to do something about that. And so we treat it. Mm-hmm. The same thing is true with government. The government has to intervene and stop that kind of stuff.
Well, speaking of intervention, one of the things that I know the government does sometimes, and it doesn't just exist here, it exists in other parts of the world as well. And we got Sasha, whose show will be coming up in about 10 minutes. It deals with Ukraine and their fight for freedom against Russia and everything like that. Is that sometimes the government will use the war economy in order to improve the economy and everything like that. That's what some people are speculating is going on with Trump's current fixation with Venezuela and the Caribbean and everything like that. So I'm just wondering, is that a danger in the capitalistic society? Is this whole notion that sometimes you have to create disruption in order to make it work better? Because that is something that's been going on even historically. We have seen periods where there has been a rough period and then there would be some sort of disruption, some sort of war that would cause everybody to unify and everything like that. So I just wondering, is that one of the dangers of capitalism?
Well, I wouldn't call it a danger endemic to capitalism. I think it's a danger for, you mentioned Russia. Obviously, Russia's not doing it in a capitalist way. They're marginally socialist. And does it help the economy? Well, if you look back over history, there have been wars that have helped economies. There have been wars that have decimated economies, sorry. And so it just depends on which war you're talking about, who the war was between. I think it would be incorrect to say that war generally helps economies. I think more likely it will harm the economy because you're committing resources to stuff that doesn't produce things. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, a part of the basic misconception of socialism and people that are worried about the rubber band is that people tend to talk about things like working for a living. Mm-hmm. Here's the thing. We don't work for a living. It's a dumb idea. You can spend all day digging holes and filling them up again, and you've done a lot of work. Why shouldn't you get paid a lot for that? Because you produced no value. What the five of us are doing here right now is trying to produce value for your listeners. Mm-hmm. Okay? We're not here out of selfishness. We're not here trying to get something for ourselves. We're here trying to create value for somebody else. Mm-hmm. Now, will we profit from it? Yes, probably. I don't know how everybody else here gets paid. Hopefully, I'm going to sell a few books out of this. Mm-hmm. So I'll make some money, but that's not why I'm here. That's not why I wrote the book. I want to create value for others. And I assume that that's what all the rest of us here want to do. And if what we do is focus on creating value, ultimately we will eliminate poverty. Because part of the problem with poverty is that too many people were brought up to believe you have to go to college. Wrong. You don't have to go to college. We need electricians. We need plumbers. We need lots of people that don't go to college. We need a lot of people who are out there creating value. And if you're out there creating value from others, you're going to do fine financially.
That makes sense and everything.
Our current government, the legislative branch, has been fairly paralyzed for years and years. And the market kind of likes that because, you've been talking of the less the government does, the more the markets are, industry is free to do what it wants. So how do you think we're doing, our national government? Is it good that we're paralyzed?
Well, I guess it depends on how it's paralyzed. I guess what I would say if I could rewrite the Constitution as far as the legislative branch is concerned, the things I would do differently, well, first thing I would do is put a time limit on every law. So any law that has huge effect, I would say maybe a 25-year limit. Some of the lesser laws, maybe 10 years, something like that, so that every law expires and has to be reauthorized. Next thing I would do is eliminate, I would make everything like the filibuster. In other words, I would say that you want to pass a law, you've got to get 65, 2/3 or 3/4 majority. Why? Because the reason we're paralyzed is because we keep going back and forth between 51 and 49% on each side of a center line. And what that means is that one time 51% are telling the other 49% what to do. And then as soon as the balance shifts, that 51%, the whole thing shifts. That's nuts. If something is a good idea, 2/3 to 3/4 of us should agree on it. And if we can't get that kind of agreement, why should it be a law?
So even, if I'm hearing you correctly, even laws that are seen as beneficial, whether it's the Civil Rights Act or the, some people would say beneficial, depending on your views, the gay rights kind of laws, and even some people that are fans of guns, the gun laws, you would have all of those laws put back up 25 years later, regardless of whether they are considered beneficial or not. Because I mean, there are some laws that some people would say are universally beneficial and have been beneficial for 50, 60 years, if not longer.
Well, sure, but if they're beneficial, they'll be reauthorized. That's the point, is that over time, we should learn. We should go, oh, I'm not happy with the way that law has been working out. Maybe we shouldn't reauthorize it. But this law, say the Civil Rights Act, is working great. Let's stick with it. Let's reauthorize it or make it stronger. See,
Would
that's
you
the
apply
thing.
that?
We
Would you
don't
apply
allow
that to,
ourselves to experiment.
would you apply that to marriage? For some people are saying "till death do us part" is no longer realistic, because when system was created, people were dead by 60 or 65. Now that we're living, and we're gonna keep living longer and longer, should marriage have an expiration date where you have to renew it after 20 years?
Well, I guess first of all, I personally think that we should divorce civil union from marriage. Civil union is a legal construct. Marriage is a religious construct. And so I would say leave marriage up to the religious folks. In other words, if the Catholic Church wants to decide a marriage lasts forever, great. If a different church wants to put a 3-year expiration date on it, fine. As far as civil union, that's something that would be up for renewal. If we pass a law saying marriage is forever, okay, 25 years or 10 years, however long the expiration date is, we reevaluate that and say, is this working for our society, or is it causing more problems? We have to be free to experiment. But the problem is that we aren't. Laws that were passed 100 years ago are still in force today, even though they aren't working.
All right, one more example. I think one of the most famous examples lately of a law that expired was we banned semi-auto rifles like AK-47s for about 20 years, and the law expired. While it was enforced, there were fewer mass shootings, but we haven't been able to reestablish that law. Is that a triumph of the system, or is that something that's messed up?
Well, first of all, mass shootings have been increasing with and without automatic weapons. I'm going to go ahead and say this. It's a little bit dangerous, but I'll say it anyway. I own an AR-15. I own a lot of guns. I was in the military. I shot expert with everything the Army had and with everything the Air Force had. I will tell you absolutely that if you were going to do a mass shooting, the last thing you would choose would be an AR-15 or an AK-47. Those are civilian versions. They are not fully automatic. They have the same rate of fire as a 9mm pistol. So people, first of all, misunderstand that.
You want me to start, Sasha? You have Ivan, and Ivan's got a video. That's what I accidentally hit earlier.
Pardon me?
Sorry. That was something else.
He was doing other business.
But the automatic versions that the military uses are called assault weapons. Why? Because they're really good for assaulting a fixed position. So if you want to take a hill, assault weapons are great. If you're in a situation, aside from a sniper situation, now in a sniper situation, something like an AK-47 is a reasonable choice for a weapon. But in most of the mass shootings, they happen in close proximity. You'd be far better off with a handgun where you could maneuver far more quickly. Now, again, like I say, this is kind of dangerous. I'm not trying to give helpful hints to mass shooters.
Mass shooters are, by definition, lunatics, so they don't think systematically. So they're going to pick the biggest, like, manliest guns, even if it's not the best gun for the job. So we're at the end of the hour. You should tell people how to get buy your book, see your website, all that stuff.
Well, my website is dougcardell.com. And my book is available for pre-order on Amazon. It won't actually be released until January 20th, but it's already we send out advanced reader copies, and so it's already got a 5-star rating on Goodreads. And I think it's going to do really well. I hope everybody out there will buy it if they want to learn more about socialism and want to learn more about the problems of capitalism. I think so far, the feedback I've been getting is that people are really getting educated.
All right. Well, I've got one more question for you. Where there are, I'd say there are kind of crazy people who say taxation is theft, and that to me, having public libraries and public roads and cops and fire departments doesn't seem to me to be socialism. It just seems to be making some reasonable concessions to the way things work. Are libraries and cops socialism?
No, not at all. Again, I am certainly nowhere near the point of saying that government is illegitimate, but I am saying that there are things the government does that are illegitimate. I mentioned my website. One of my articles on my website, if you want to look it up, is called Tax Hikes. And it explains the tax system in terms of a hike. So we have a group of 100 people that are about to go on a hike, and they've decided, 51% of them decided that we're going to allocate the amount of weight that in the packs that each person carries is going to be allocated by the fitness of the individuals. And the way it turned out was the fittest individuals had to carry 421 pounds. And the next group of people had to carry, I think it was 200 thereabouts. You can look on my website and see it, and it's obviously ridiculous, but that's exactly what the U.S. tax structure is like. Exactly. I took the numbers of the weights from the U.S. tax structure. So the people in the highest tax bracket are paying 42%. They're carrying a gigantic amount of the weight. They pay 42% of the taxes paid.
Well, okay. So
we'll probably have to continue this later because we're running into the other program.
One quick question: are we better off tax structure wise than in the early '60s when the highest tax bracket was 91% above $1 million?
We're definitely better off than we were then, but we'd be far better off with a flat tax.
Okay.
Well, we want to thank our special guest, Dr. Doug Cardell, and hopefully everybody here will buy his book. I'm going to have to look at how I buy it in Spain because I'm in Barcelona, but we'll just have to see how that goes. And we'll see you tomorrow on World Edition. Bye-bye.